Welcome. Thank you for coming. We're diving right on in because I'm packing a lot of info into a really short amount of time. My research topic is the intersection of transgender identity, punk, alternative, and subculture identity, and hiring discrimination, as you could probably tell by the title of my segment. Before we start, here's a little bit of context for the project and who in the world I might be. My name is Stephan Oliveira, I use he, him pronouns, and I've worked extensively in LGBT+ activism in my community because I'd come out when I was in middle school during 2015. At the time, the environment had been incredibly hostile, and my only safe social space had been in online communities. As a consequence of quarantine, many of us began seeking our social connections through the internet. I found myself using TikTok far more during the pandemic, as well as many other teens my age. As I perused this digital community, I recognized that there was a bit of a trend going on here. That trend being the rise of a distinct subculture identity, as well as a resurgence of several other subculture identities, broadly categorized as alternative. Many alternative subcultures reflect society during their time, which would explain why so many kids these days are getting involved in these styles again. In a time of significant political unrest in regards to the recent presidential administration and election, a burst in civil rights activism related to systemic racism and other forms of systemic injustice, and a global pandemic, it makes sense why many youth are crafting a subculture identity influenced by subcultures that highlighted hypocrisy and injustice and revolved around the philosophy of revolution. Something that I'd personally noticed with a lot of the teens getting involved in these styles was that many of them identified as transgender and or non-binary. Thus, I decided to research the intersection between these identities, as well as how and why they often overlap. But before we even delve into the topic, let's establish some context for the topic of gender. In my research, I provide my own perspective on the topic of gender by synthesizing my analysis of the case of David Reimer with analysis of Judith Butler's essay, Imitation and Gender Insubordination. Reimer was a baby who experienced a complication with a circumcision that led his family to be guided to raise Reimer as a female and pursue the modification of his sexual anatomy. He faced significant psychological distress because of it and eventually asserted himself as a male later in his life. His circumstances demonstrate how there is some biological component to one's gender identity, and that one's experience with their physical form as it relates to gender is not solely the product of societal conditioning. Meanwhile, during the second wave of the feminist movement, many LGBT+ individuals in particular began discussing and theorizing about the topic of gender. Judith Butler was one of these theorists whose ideas gained significant attention. She's well known for her influence in the field of philosophy, as well as feminist and queer theory. She is largely credited for the concept that gender is a social construct, particularly for her quote that gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. The quote can be interpreted to imply that gender is an attempt to categorize gender identity. Within my work, I use these two cases to demonstrate that there are technically infinite gender identities. The number of gender identities that exist should be equal to the amount of people that exist, because every person experiences their gender in a different way. Many people have overlapping experiences, so gender as a construct attempts to lump those similar experiences together into these vaguely shaped boxes of male, female, non-binary, as well as descriptors such as transgender or cisgender. The way that Western society has approached gender by solely defining one by a male-female model and taking a bioessentialist approach is outdated and needs to update with the knowledge that scientific and sociological communities have brought forward. We all know about the concepts of male and female, and in our society, we conflate gender with gender roles and gender roles with gender identity. Gender roles are the characteristics and traits that most of our culture has associated with a certain gender. However, many other cultures don't have this binary system, or at least before colonization, they had a different way to look at gender. In my accompanying research paper, I elaborate more on specific presentations of various non-binary and transgender identities in other cultures. Colonization caused a lot of these identities to become far more ostracized because the binary male-female model had been imposed upon them. Despite this, those with diverse LGBT+ identities still created their own communities, each reflecting a distinct culture and personality that bled into pop culture as well in subtle ways. And we're going to look at some of that. More specifically, we're discussing how LGBT+ communities and the cultures that thrived within those communities impacted the punk movement in the 1970s. The punk movement has significantly influenced modern alternative styles. Many of the styles that we see today for alternative kids are significantly rooted within the punk movement's founding ideologies and spirit, the spirit of revolution. The book Pretty Vacant by Phil Strongman provides a comprehensive history of the punk movement. Punk directly contradicted the culture of passivity and the hippie attitude of the time. It took inspiration from many queer icons as well, most notably the Velvet Underground, the New York Dolls, and Iggy Pop. Each of these performers had incorporated elements of gender nonconformity and explicit sexuality to provide shock value to their performances, which granted major pushback against their music and a lack of recognition during their time. One of the major bands considered to be like the forefront of the punk movement was the Sex Pistols, who became banned at countless locations because of their obscene nature. They were loud, aggressive, angry, pro-labor, anti-system, anti-corporations, and pro-revolution. They derived a lot of their inspiration from the aforementioned artists. But that's not to say that the punk movement was free of fault. The normalization of anti-Semitism for shock value, rampant drug addiction and violence, and far-right extremism in the US punk scene are just a few of the issues that Strongman touches on in his book. There was also hypocrisy within the punk scene because of the refusal of support towards LGBT+ individuals, while simultaneously donning the community's elements for shock value. Speaking of that intersection, there's actually a pretty cool article by this professor at Yale named Tavian Nyong'o, who delved into this topic. Professor Nyong'o largely focuses on a teaching of a variety of studies such as Black diaspora performance, cultural studies, as well as social and critical theory. He wrote this article that plucked apart a ton of the history surrounding the intersections of punk and queer identity back in the 70s. While Strongman did justice in providing accurate references to a variety of inspirations that defined the punk movement, Nyong'o takes it one step further and analyzes the philosophical motivations underlying the punk movement and connecting them to the queer culture of the era. He focuses a bit on the concept of reproductive futurity, which is kind of this idea that talks about the fear of the future and how we are contributing to that future via our offspring. For many people who looked at the punk movement, it felt like a self-destructive lifestyle, especially because of popular songs like No Future that directly featured that pessimistic outlook. In a time that encouraged people to conform to the construction of the nuclear family, the act of not going with that lifestyle was considered revolutionary. For many LGBT+ individuals, they were made to take a non-traditional route that usually didn't involve having kids, especially because of the stigma surrounding those relationships. Being LGBT+ at the time was analogous to an act of rebellion that encouraged anarchism, which is largely defined as an ideology that wishes to abolish authority and promote inclusivity and equality as a consequence of the abolishment of authority. Rejecting a system that promotes heterosexuality and cisnormativity was seen as a threat, similar to how punk ideology had been seen as a threat to the established systems of the time. Punk had gained so much popularity because of its outlandish, upfront, and aggressive nature that it refused to conform. It borrowed so much from trends that had been popular within the LGBT+ community, partially because those elements were considered shocking to the general public and garnered the attention that those bands wished to have. So when we consider the intersections between the two communities, of course, we focus upon the ideological motivations underlying both communities, as well as how the punk movement borrowed elements of gender expression experimentation from the LGBT+ community. But we can also look at attributes that are a bit more physical. For example, tattoos, piercings, and gauges are just some of the body modifications that are common within both communities. Dyed hair also deserves an honorary mention. The first three have significant ties to non-Western cultures. It's really interesting with tattoos in particular because the function that they served in non-European cultures is drastically different from the function that they served within European cultures. Selma Schmid's essay on the history of tattoos, published with the University of Zurich, Switzerland, analyzes those historical differences. In Europe, tattoos had label style and typically indicated that someone was a criminal or exile, but in other cultures, tattoos had served as an extension of the internal identity and were intended to be an organic piece of the body. In modern culture, we see the blending of these styles in the patchwork style of tattoo that has become more popularized. The usage of patch-style tattoos to express one's identity is symbolic of the process of decolonization that has begun in the modern era. Here's where the topic of body modifications intersects with transgender identity. Considering these statistics regarding gender affirmation procedures, an often necessary step for trans individuals to acquire for their well-being, it makes sense why many trans people have the aforementioned body modifications. The aforementioned modifications effectively alter the physical form to change the way that one is perceived. They act as a way more accessible form of gender affirmation. So with this information, we also have to remember that many body modifications are considered unprofessional in the workplace. It makes sense, especially considering the anti-establishment intentions of many of those subcultures. Those styles are an implicit threat to the establishment, but many of these attributes are derived from transgender and LGBT plus culture in general, so there becomes an inaccurate villainization of those identities by association. Especially when you look at the unemployment rate for transgender people, which is around 16% compared to the general 9% of working age Americans pre-pandemic, it makes sense why these individuals face such a difficult time finding work. The system of society that favors cisgender, gender-conforming individuals does not wish to incorporate transgender experiences because acknowledging gender diversity threatens the supremacy of those with societal privilege. This knowledge can be applied to reevaluate the beliefs that we hold regarding gender, how we view our own gender identities, and this subjective concept of professionalism. In doing so, we learn where we can establish or reform policies and produce change that can help reduce the stigmatization of marginalized identities. Although the focus of this presentation was on transgender identity, this logic extends to LGBT plus identity as a whole, as well as the intersectionality that comes with racial identity. Highlighting the need to reform company policies that it doesn't discriminate against those with alternative forms of expression implicitly assists in normalizing identities that may be deemed alternative. So I leave you with a thank you for tuning into this topic. There is much more to be said, but I hope you enjoyed what I had the time to provide for today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me either by messaging me through Instagram, or if you wish to be more formal, here's my email as well. And of course, here's the link to the paper. If you want to send it directly to you, feel free to contact me individually. Now we'll open up the Q&A session.